saligang batas. So ang simple lang po yung tanong ko, wag na po nating balikan yun kasi pag ang haba po tayo. Simpleng tanong, boss. Pabor po ba ang NEDA na amyendahan yung 60-40? Yung hinihingi po ni Senator Gatchalian. Pabor po ba kayo na ito po ba'y makakatulong sa ekonomiya? Itong pag-aamenda ng saligang batas. Kalimutan na po natin yung sinasabi natin ng mga bagong batas. Kasi po, ang sinasabi nga ng karamihan, ito ay illegal. Hindi niyo po ako pwedeng sabihin na against ako dyan dahil galing po yung batas na yan doon sa aking presidente, ex-president. Kaya kung akong tatanungin niyo ako, pabor ako dyan sa batas na yan. Pero hindi, ang pinag-uusapan po natin ngayon ay ang katotohanan. Ano ba yung katotohanan? Kine-question ito. Kine-question. Ang lahat ng bagay na may question, pag dumating sa Supreme Court, halimbawa, ako yung dayuhan, may pera ako, nag-invest na ako, nandyan na, biglang dinesisyonan ng Supreme Court, illegal yung batas, patay tayo dyan, boss. Yun ang inaano po natin. Ano po ba kayo? Pabor na amendahan, ang 60-40 na yan, o hindi? Yun lang po, boss.
Ayaw pa sagutin, ano?
The NEDA has no objection to departing from constitutional provision on foreign equity restriction. But of course, we leave such wisdom to Congress. We think that this will enable us to quickly step up in order to meet the requisites of modern economies. Thank you po.
Ayun, napakaganda po, sir. Yun lang po ang gusto namin madinig. Wala po kayong objection. Napakasarap pong madinig niyan, boss. Maraming salamat po, Sir Bien. Opo, salamat po. Wag po kayong aalis, Sir Bien, ha? Marami po pong magaganap.
Salamat po.
Opo, tatanungin ko lang po, meron po kayong, opo, meron lang po akong itatanong kay Ma'am Shulita Monsod. Ma'am, gusto ko lang pong tanungin kung sa inyo po bang palagay, magkakaroon po ba ng magandang epekto kung atin pong aamendahan ang economic provision sa 1987 Constitution?
Ang stand ko po is that amending those constitutions are neither necessary nor sufficient to attract foreign direct investment. Hindi po necessary. Just the fact that, the economic provisions, the economic restrictive, economic provisions are 7, and the resolution now talks only about public utilities, advertising, and media, means to say that, somehow or other, the other restrictive provisions have been taken care of without having to touch the Constitution. So that's what my presentation is all about. The economic provisions of the Constitution, the so-called restrictive. Amending that is neither necessary nor will amending it, bring in a flood of foreign direct investments, because there are other. If you will allow me to make my presentation, I will do it. But that's the crux of my point.
Okay po, pakinggan ko lang po si Secretary Michael Castillo.
Mr. Chair,
Okay, President.
there is no problem for an equity requirement on certain sectors of the economy, because that is a tool for regulation. But it doesn't have to be in the Constitution. It has to be given to Congress to determine which particular enterprise would require equity requirement. Because by keeping it in the Constitution, it limits the power of Congress to define policies and to enact policies that would in fact support economic progress. The fact that it is in the Constitution, it is a constraint in there is no problem that in every enterprise, the Congress will define, okay, in this particular sector, it's 70-30. In this particular sector, it's 60-40. Then in another sector, it must be 51-49. There is nothing wrong with that. But if it is in the Constitution, I think it is limiting.
No, I am just saying that the limitations have not, the provisions have not either affected anybody. I will show you the studies that have been made, Philippine studies that have been made that show that, restrictiveness and the fact that, the resolutions talks about the Philippines is the most restrictive with respect to foreign direct investment. Hindi ba yan ang one of your whereas clauses ng resolution? Sabi ng resolution, the Philippines is the third most restrictive country in the world, and therefore that has prevented foreign direct investment from coming in. Well, I just wanted to point out that foreign direct investment restrictiveness index that has been going on from 1997, then it started again in 2003, then it's 2006, then 2010, all the way up. That restrictiveness index shows that 1997, 2003, 2006, 2010, all the way to 2014, the most restrictive country in the world with respect to foreign direct investment was China. And China received the largest amount. So restrictiveness does not make any difference if there's a profit to be made. All right? And then, so hindi lang ng China. Let's talk about the Philippines. The Philippines became number one in 2015, I think, and 2016. Basta after 2014, China ang number one. After 2015, the Philippines became number one. And yet, if you will look at the data, the most foreign investment we have gotten 16 and 17. In 18, it started to go down, and it is now going down. So I'm saying this restrictiveness, lifting the restrictiveness is not necessary. To all intents and purposes, for all intents and purposes, the door to foreign direct investment is open. They don't come in. And why don't they come in? It's not because of restrictiveness or not, because the Philippines most restrictive, so much money came in, right? So let's look at the evidence. Let's not just argue. Let's look at the evidence, because so many people have made studies on foreign direct investment and have made their conclusions on the basis of those empirical studies, not on the basis of arguments. Let's just look at the data, the hard evidence, and it will show you.
Sir Castillo?
Well, we have to look at two sides of the coin. One question is, does it limit? The other one is, does it benefit? Now, I have never found any study that would point to a conclusion that the 60-40 requirement in our constitution actually benefited the nation in terms of economic progress and in terms of our ability to create jobs for our people. So it has to be two ways that we have to look into.
Secretary Carlos?
May I add to the continuing conversation here? While it is true that empirical evidence provided by Professor Monsod shows that the restriction for 60-40 may not be the predictor variable for inflow of foreign direct investment, there are other variables that in fact prevented or were obstacles to the coming in of foreign investment, and the level of corruption is one of them. And there are studies that will support this. So I agree with my colleague here and my former student also, Eric. Robin, practically everybody in the room is my student if you've been teaching as long as I have. So yes, now we're really looking at context of empirical evidence. And that really occurs in the social science literature. Even in the natural science literature, this occurs. But I think we must see the preponderance of evidence, meaning which has the most pluses that will pursue the argument that we were making earlier in the session. And not only that, we have to show remarkably and arguably that in fact the studies being compared are comparable. So there's no question about empirical evidence in regard to this. So we are not saying that the 60-40 is the predictor variable. There are other predictor variables for why foreign investment comes or does not come. Thank you.
Maraming salamat po. Ma'am, magpipresent po kayo. Sige po. Opo. Ma'am, makinig lang po tayo sandali sa presentation. Wag muna kayong aalis, ma'am.
I hope you don't mind, but I have a speaking engagement in another geography. So,
Ilang
Yes,
gaano
sir.
katagal po ito, ma'am? Yung
to show you everything about it.
sige po. Pwede po natin balikan po yan, ma'am, hanggang sa makaalis lang po si Secretary Carlos. Mag-move lang po kami ng konti. Tapos pag alis po ni Secretary Carlos, then Opo. Papadalan ko po kayo ng copy. Opo. Ituloy lang po natin hanggang 10 minutes po. 10 minutes, pwede? Opo. Meron lang po akong mga gustong, ma'am. Sana po masagot niyo po ako tungkol po dito. Yung pong sa loob po ba ng halimbawa po, halimbawa lang po, yung parliamentary, balik po tayo sa parliamentary kasi kanina po sinasabi po ng ating propesora na nagkaroon din po talaga ng mga issue ng korupsyon, ng hindi pag-unlad itong mga parliamentary. Ito po bang mga bansa na ito ay totoong nag-parliamentary? Ito po bang mga bansang binanggit ng ating pong profesora? O ito po yung kwentong kutsero lang din na parliamentary?
Well, like democracies, parliamentary systems come in many, many permutations. So it is not as if, the parliamentary system would be like the House of Commons, because India is also parliamentary, Singapore, etc., because they have to deal with the political culture on the ground. So that means they change the configuration of the parliamentary system, but the principles that I articulated earlier, they're basic principles. In other words, you can't call yourself parliamentary if you don't have a fusion of executive, legislative. You don't have a right to oust the prime minister if he loses the majority. There are fundamental principles without which you don't label yourself parliamentary. That said, again, let me say that in the course of hypothesis testing, that is, you're trying to show the relationship between certain kinds of variables which are causing certain things and having an effect, then you have an array of variables there which differ in all the 200 economies and states. And while it is true that we can present evidence after evidence, empirical evidence, many of these conclusions are colliding, or if they are moving in the same direction, are talking about different issue areas. So I'm sorry to disappoint those of us who think that the social science can declare certain things. We cannot. In fact, if you will notice, most of my statements are tentative. They are likelihoods. Because in fact, my sentences will not end in a period. My sentences will end in an ellipsis. Because that's far. Because as a scholar, I can be corrected by another empirical evidence, which has harder evidence. But still, I argue, and it's not just based on argument, compelling arguments, but this will be based on empirical evidence, which I did not prepare for in terms of titles and authors. That is still, there are more pluses and minuses. There will be less corruption in a parliamentary system rather than in a presidential system. There will be less corruption in a federal system rather than in a unitary system, because the accountability of the ministers involved is closer to the ground. It's very easy to kick out a minister. By the way, there are two kinds of responsibility, senators, your honors. Individual responsibility and collective responsibility, which means that a minister can in fact be compelled to resign on the basis of behavior which is not acceptable. You remember, Eric, the Minister of Defense Profumo? Minister of Defense Profumo, Great Britain, was sleeping with, what's her name? I forgot. another British woman, and the British woman was sleeping with a Soviet also defense minister. So he got kicked out. Here you notice he got kicked out as an individual minister. But you can have collective responsibility. That's why we have the principle of you sink or swim with the government of the day. That's the reason why I said earlier that the parliamentary system, in fact, engenders discipline in the political party, because you are going to sink if you do not toe the party line. So the individual and collective responsibility is one other hallmark of a parliamentary system. And that one is something which I think as a plus of the parliamentary system vis-a-vis the presidential. Thank you.
Salamat po. Meron pong isang tanong pa. Di ba po ang parliamentary, iba't iba din yan? Meron din siyang parang style ng Germany, may style ng UK. Ano po kaya ang nababagay sa, halimbawa lang po, sa Pilipinas, ano pong nababagay na parliamentary sa atin?
Siguro ang maganda nating kopyahin. Total, nangangopya-ngopya tayo. Kopyahin natin na maganda. Siguro, Senator Robin, ano yung, sa Germany kasi yung constructive vote of non-confidence. Natandaan nyo si Angela Merkel stayed there for 16 years. Bakit 16 years siya? Kasi nga walang term limit, di ba? But because the CSU-CDU continued to control the Bundestag, no, for 16 years. But the only way to kick out Angela Merkel is for you to have another one to replace her. That's why it's called constructive vote of non-confidence. Hindi ka pwede mag-kick out ng premier or chancellor hanggang wala kang inilalagay in his or her place to be voted by the same absolute number of votes. So you will not have a constant rotation of governments of the day na, you know, willy-nilly, you just kick out the premier kasi ayaw mo yung pagmumukha niya or for whatever reason. No? You can only kick him out. And that is one thing that we should copy, by the way, when we draft a new constitution. Constructive vote of non-confidence.
German po, German. So doon pala tayo dapat pumunta, pare ko. Oo, Senator.
Well, Secretary Carlos mentioned Germany. Yung party list system yata natin, we tried to copy the German model, but we Filipinized it. And then, but I've heard mga reporters reporting on the German electoral system, and sabi nila, we need to be rocket scientists to understand their system. So, ingat-ingat lang tayo sa German model. Siguro maganda siguro sa broad strokes, siguro sa forma, pero